Hello and welcome to my video, how to make more money with easy to use software. My name is Al, MD261 McLennan, poker pro and coach and video maker for about 10 years now. And I'm going to do a video and it's going to show how you can make more money with very simple software which doesn't cost much but makes a huge difference to how much you can make every day and can make thousands or even tens of thousands of dollars difference per year. The format the video is going to take going to be a live sweat session for about 10 to 15 minutes. I'm going to be using the software called Tournament Shark to find out information on our opponents, how good they are, how bad they are, what positions they finish in, and use that to make inferences and deductions about their style, which mean that even without many statistics on someone, I'm able to make more positive EV moves than normal. So these are moves that without this information from Tournament Shark I wouldn't be able to make, and therefore I wouldn't make as much money. And after that we're going to really break down each of those moves, each of those spots in depth, and analyse the different options and what strategic changes it can make. So as soon as we get to the first hand, we get a whole bunch of information about the players at the table. Now here's a good example. 4-3 suited. It's not necessarily a hand I would choose to play. But the guy who's limped is clearly a weak player. An average buy-in of $8, clearly a losing player. But when I look at the positions that he finished, the E with a percentage sign stands for early position finishing, i.e. in the first 20% of players he's gone out. Now, if there's a weak player who has a very high early finishing position, such as this guy here, I would assume that it's never going to make any sense to lead out in a spot like we just had, because he's not going to fold. How does someone manage to get busted first or second in a tournament all the time? Well, by not folding, by floating with overcards, by floating with undercards, by making a lot of moves. Either way, the way that you get value from a player like that is to have a hand, even a marginal strength hand, and to take it down like that. That's very different to the actual player that we had, Chaddy, who also was a relatively weak player, only played 400 games, low stakes, lost money. But as you can see, he hasn't busted out really early or even early middle position all that often. So you would think that there is a bit more fold equity. And it's useful when thinking about other things as well. Let's say you raise your pocket 8s from early position and Chaddy reships you from the small blind. Well, I'm going to be more inclined to think that he actually has a hand because he doesn't push that wide. And this is without any holder manager stats. I know this. I've actually removed the holder manager stats because I didn't want it to confuse what Tournament Shark can show you. It can tell me this guy isn't going to be going all in early that much, because if he was, with lots of hands, he would have a very high early finish position exit. Contrast that to R2D2 1976. If I min-raise my 8s under the gun and he reships first hand from the small blind, I'm going to call him off in a second, in a heartbeat. For example here, I min-raise, R2D2 goes all in, I'm calling him. Ace-9 suited, not a normal call, but this is what it's told me. This is what I've learnt from the stats. And this is the kind of information that it can give. It's really, really useful in that sense. It doesn't just let you know who are the players who you can generate the most money from, who are the weakest opponents. It actually tells you a bit about how you can expect them to play. And that's the real valuable part, I think. Because it lets you make just very profitable decisions. It's no good just knowing someone's a weak player. You want to know, well, how do I exploit him? And sometimes you have to wait a little bit too long for those stats to come through. Here's another prime example. Considering I know he gets busted out early, I imagine he doesn't fold early that often. Therefore, I'm going to put in an enormous raise, and I fully expect him to call a good 30% of the time, even more. More than he should. Chaddy is much more likely to fold in that spot. So, I'll check just a little bit of tactical. I checked the flop just so he could maybe catch up, pick up a piece of something. But that's a great example of how I can use Tournament Shark to exploit an opponent. How does R2D2 go out early? Well, once he limps, he really wants to see a flop. He really wants to see if he has the best hand. And so I could raise a huge amount for exactly that reason. And here with this hand, just to, once he calls, I'm going to put him on a range of draws, or weak pairs. A player like this, I'm not really looking to take it away from. There's an actual reasonable chance that I might be ahead here, but he could well have spiked a queen or a king. But it's a good example of how it actually really can help you play against someone even without stats. I'm gonna load up my Hold'em Manager as well, just to get some statistics overlaid on top of it. When debating whether to ship over the top of a limp, if you're looking for fold equity, Chaddy's a much better person to do it against. R2D2 would not be so good. You'd need a quality hand because you would expect him to call a lot more. I'm going to load up another table so we can get another bunch of players, see what we can learn about them. But before I do that, I'm just going to go through the players here. Obviously the HUD overlays everything so that you can see at a glance at the table what their in the money is, and things like that. It's fully customizable. This heads-up display here is fully customizable. You can say only show me 9-player tables, only show me 6-player tables. By default, it doesn't have heads-up. In an MTT, you can break it down by binds and stack size. There's so many things you can do with this. You can have it show whatever stats you want on the table at the time. It doesn't have to show these default ones. You can change how it appears, how translucent it is, what the colours are. The possibilities are endless. Really, you can just tweak this to exactly what you want it to tell you. And actually, here would be a useful time. I wouldn't raise my a6 here, even though I think R2D2 is quite wide, because I don't think there's an amount I can raise where I can be that sure that he will fold. Regarding Turkmendo, haven't played a lot of games, don't know much about him. His split of finished positions is relatively weighted towards early, so I expect there's a good chance he can get busted early. Val 1k, these are pretty good stats he's got right here, so I'm going to assume he's a relatively competent player. Therefore, he's unlikely to float in a spot like this. He's much more likely to either reship or fold. So therefore, I'm going to raise because he doesn't know that I'm wide at this point. And the sample size is useful. So for Gen 7, he's almost certainly going to be a good player based on his sample size and his results. Obviously, there's a flip side that his average stake is low, but still, he's most likely going to be a solid, relatively tight player. I'm getting called by R2D2. I'm a bit worried that he might actually have an ace. It's hard to know for sure. I'm not really going to get involved at this spot. Yes, I could well be ahead, but it's going to cost me my entire stack to find out. I'm fairly well situated on this table. So that's what we've learned about this player in this table. So I'm going to load up a second table, see if we can get any interesting stats. I'm going to mainly focus on, I will talk about the odd hand here and there, but I'm mainly going to focus on how you can use Tournament Shark to massively increase your profitability at the tables. A prime example would be there. If I'm there with 7, 8, 9 big blinds, R2D2 limps, I'm going to be shoving a much wider range than I normally would. The reason being, I imagine he'll limp a much wider range because he goes out in the early stages a lot more often. And just generally looking at his stats, it's a very, very poor ROI. He's lost a reasonable amount of money. I'm going to shove this in here because I don't really want to get flatted when I'm in raise, which he's likely to do. Just registered for a second tournament to just come up here. So now I know on the bubble with a low stakes but decent player and someone who is not, in fact, not a decent player. So I'm not going to be looking to make any kind of moves, but against a good player, I'd probably just fold here or ship because I would assume that if I limp, I'm just going to get raised on. But R2D2, he's not going to understand the bubble necessarily, so limping is a much more acceptable option because he's much more likely to just check, because clearly someone with results like this can't understand how bubble dynamics work, doesn't realise the power that he has. There's a debatable raise, and I get shoved over the top, and that's that. You could make a case for just folding there, considering the range of hands that R2D2 actually plays. So we've got quite a good table here. We've got a relatively break-even regular, a mild losing player, and well, someone who got their stats blocked, unfortunately, and two losing players. But the one to note, the one that I'm really going to note here, is this JAAAE84. This early finish position is, wow, that's an early finish position. I'm just going to remove my HUD because obviously it's fine for me to use it, but for other people it can be confusing to have that many numbers on there. But this guy here, I'm happy to get it all in 25 big blinds deep with ace 10 off suit, because he's got a 43% early finish position. I can put in 80% of my stack, and I wouldn't be surprised if he flattered me with something like 10 queen offsuit. I'm really looking to get involved with this player, because deep stacked I'll be able to stack him off. So this hand here, this is normally a fold, but I look here and I say, well, there's a reg in the big blind, and he's limped. I want to get involved with him, and I don't want the reg to be involved. If this guy also was a weak player, I'd just limp along, but I just want to isolate here. Going to have one stab at this pot because, let's be honest, if he's got much of anything, he's going to follow it all the way to the end. That's what his stats tell him. But there's another example of just how having this tournament sharp just enables me to play more profitably. The value of a player like JAAE, the amount of chips that can be won from him is so high that I'm willing to min-raise something like 9-8 offsuit here, just to try and have an opportunity to get involved with him. So when the reg re-raises here, I know, you know, I know he's an alright player. I know his range is therefore going to be relatively strong, so I'm just giving up. So let's have a little look. Let's analyse what we've seen. And the real question is, how does Tournament Shark make me more money? Because unless it's going to make more money for you, there's not really any point in using it. That's the name of the game. And we're going to use the actual live examples just from the tournaments that we just played, and we're going to talk through how to make the most profitable decisions as a direct result of Tournament Shark. So situations where without Tournament Shark, a different decision would likely have been made. So this was the first one. It was the very first hand of the very first tournament, and we've got an interesting situation. The player's limped on the button, and we're in a small blind. And we know that the button, who is limping, Chaddy79, is a weak player. And we know that the big blind is also a weak player. Both lost, you know, a reasonable amount of money. So that will affect our range. We're not going to be looking to limp necessarily hands that will hit marginal strengths holdings. So a hand like, say, Jack 6 offsuit or something like 6-9 offsuit isn't so strong because it hasn't really got bust out potential. You're going to hit a second pair or a third pair a lot of the time. Weak opponents, generally speaking, it's very hard to play those hands. Your money comes from having the good hand and them calling off with their second best hand. So we know we're going to lean towards hands with bust out potential. We're going to limp wider than normal because they're both weak players. And we need hand with big potential because weaker players will tend to go deeper in hand. So we can't limp a wide range thinking, well, maybe we can pick out some good spots to take it down. So suited hands, connected hands, those are the kind of hands we're going to play, including this 4-3 suited here. And the flop comes out, and it's actually a terrible flop for our hand. I know some people think I've picked up a straight draw, but I mean, it adds 4 outs. By and large, you're not really going to hit those 4 outs. So it's not actually a great flop for the hand. It's also unlikely to have hit anyone. Why do I say that? Well, there's only two twos in the deck. The button is unlikely to have limped a 2. The big blind could well have a 2. And the button is also relatively unlikely to limp an ace. With very few stats, it's worth assuming still that most people will raise an ace on the button first in. So we don't have any showdown value. We have got, I guess, a backdoor flush draw and a gut shot, but we've also got 4 high. So normally speaking, this would just be a spot where you say, well, these aren't the right opponents to try and take a stab against. I don't know what I can really represent. I'm just going to check fold. Not really the case here. The reason being, if we have a look there, Chaddy79 hasn't actually got a hugely skewed early finish position. That's basically how often they get busted out right at the start of the tournament. Now, with some weak players, it's up around, well, 39 to even as high as 45% of the time. And those are the players who, they're really, you need a hand to bust them early, and you don't even need that much of a hand to bust them early. But do not ever try and bluff them, because they love getting all their chips in early on, so they don't fold. Their weakness is not that they ever fold when they shouldn't fold. You're not going to make your money by bluffing them. But with Chaddy here, tells me that, this could be a profitable spot to lead out, because he doesn't just chuck away his chips early as much as most people with his kind of results would. He just limped first in, so he's unlikely to have an ace, and he can fold. If R2D2, he's in the big blind, he doesn't feel committed to the pot, he hasn't put money in. Even weak players will generally just see if they hit the flop from the big blind and view it as a free hit. These two players, if they're switched the other way around, I'm going to be slightly less inclined to bet, because R2D2 has a much early finish position exit, so he's much more likely to float with 10 jack, 10 queen, those kind of cards, just because he wants to see if he hits something, and he's fine investing chips to do it. The second spot where I think Tournament Shark really showed some value was the min raise here with the ace-9 suited under the gun. Now, it doesn't help you make the raise, it's a fairly standard raise. But normally, when if you raise under the gun here, and someone reships, and everyone here has got in the region of, 13 to 16 big blinds, you'd be folding. You wouldn't expect anyone's range to be wide enough here to make it anything other than a standard fold to a re-steal. But even without the stats, new players at the table, we know from the early finish position of R2D2 and his overall results that there's a good chance that he would be reshipping with a very, very weak hand. The only way you can get busted out that early, that often, is by getting all in with very weak hands. So I would be surprised if he wasn't happy going all in with something like King Jack, King 10, Ace 5, Ace 3 suited. You may think, no, surely no one's going to be playing those hands, but that's the only way you get the Tournament Shark stats that he has, is by doing exactly that. So we now know that we can fold to every player at the table, which is standard, but Tournament Shark has told us, except one. If R2D2 goes all in, it's profitable to call him. And the second spot that came up again with R2D2 was when he limped under the gun. Now, sometimes you can be a bit wary about someone trapping or something like that, but Tournament Shark tells us don't worry about that. He gets busted early. That's probably not from trapping early, it's from limping with weak hands and then not folding them. And in fact, because we know he doesn't fold them, our options change. In this spot you can either, generally speaking, ship or put in a standard raise to something like 90. Now, I mean, you could consider checking, but I would never really consider that. Here though, Tournament Shark tells us there's no need for the smaller raise. He likes to get busted out early. That means he loves to see a flop. He's very unlikely to fold. Therefore, you should either be shipping or putting in an extra large raise. I prefer going for the extra large raise. My opinion is, if a weak player is limped, he wants to see the flop if you ship. He may just say, you know what, I can't call all in with 10 jack off suit. But if you put in half his stack and make him completely pot committed, they're likely to call with a large chunk of what they limped with. Even if they limp with 8-9 offsuit, 10 queen suited, they're very likely to call because it's not all in and they want to see the flop. And indeed he does. Then we got to a very interesting situation where this 7-9 offsuit, by and large, is almost certainly a fold. But we got a very particular confluence of players. We know that the big blind is a reg, which means he's unlikely to flat. He's probably going to reship or fold. He's going to assume that with me raising here, he hasn't got any fold equity. I must have a strong hand. Therefore, I wouldn't expect him to play back with any more than maybe 18, 20% of his range, and I expect him to fold the remaining 80% of it. But what about the small blind? You could say, well, why would you do, you wouldn't just because one person might fold enough, small blind won't. But because I know he's such a weak player, I'm happy to min raise because I hope that he will flat some of the time. Okay, obviously the ideal situation is that he folds, but as long as he flats rather than re-raises, I don't really mind because we're extremely deep stacked at this point. I mean, we both got 23 big blinds. So I don't mind being in position with a playable hand, admittedly not a great hand, but in position against a very weak player with a skill edge with a hand that isn't completely useless. That's a fine scenario for me. I'm not concerned about that. So you combine those two things and it makes it a profitable raise, and in the end they both just fold. Great success. And I think here's the most non-standard spot where Tournament Shark really comes into its own. This spot here, I mean, this is a standard push spot by and large. Knowing how weak our opponent is, it may actually be a fold spot, bizarrely, just because you expect to be called by such a wide range. I find it very hard to believe that you wouldn't get called here by something like King 6 suited, 10 Jack offsuit, just because he's that bad of a player and he's that loose of a player. But what else do we know? Well, Tournament Shark tells us that his R2D2's results mean that he doesn't understand the bubble dynamics. He can't do and be such a losing player. So if he doesn't understand the bubble dynamics, chances are he doesn't understand ICM, so he's likely to call all in much wider than he should, which would be a reason not to push all in. But by the same token, he's calling all in wide because he doesn't realise the power that he has on the bubble. In this bubble, he is king, big stack, against two regs, basically. That's the perfect time to push people around, because they both know that they can't afford to lose their chips. But he won't actually realise that, so he won't push as much as a reg would in this spot when limped to. A lot of regs will shove 100% if you limp to them here. And we'll have a skill edge playing them post flop, so it makes limping the correct move. And we limp, he checks. Obviously he would still have raised, you can see his stats, he still would have raised a large chunk of hands, but you know what, that doesn't matter. If we assume that he'd have raised most of the hands that are better than us, it means that now that we've hit the flop, we don't think he has many queens or, king 8s or queen 10s in his range, so almost all of the range that he has is weaker than ours, so we know that we can go all the way with this hand on the bubble. We didn't risk our tournament life pushing into a guy who's going to call wide. We wait until we hit solid value against a weak player who is likely to fold, likely to give away a lot of chips post flop. So we wait until we hit a hand before investing chips on a bubble. If we move on to the second game in the sweat session, very, very early on, there was an interesting situation. Button raised to just over 4 times the big blind. We're there with ace-5 suited. Now, a lot of people raise the button quite wide, but we have a fair bit of information. What we can assume is that we will get called, and therefore we should not assume any fold equity. How can we do that? Well, the player's rating on Tournament Shark is that he's very, very weak. More's the point, he has just about the highest early finish position you will really ever see. He busts out early all the time. That doesn't mean that he wouldn't call with worse hands. I could easily see him calling with, well, to be honest, with a 40% early finish position, I can see him calling with pretty much anything. 9, 10 offsuit, Jack 7 suited. Those are the kind of hands you really need to be getting involved with to get busted out this early. So you could say, well, why not jam in the ace-5 suited? And the answer is, you can actually get more profitable spots against him. You'll make a lot of chips, but you won't make a lot of equity because this is a sit and go. You don't want to get really involved if he has 9, 10 off and you're ace-5 suited for 25 big blinds. Your chips are worth more than that. However, if I had something like King Queen or King Jack suited, I would just jam it in because I'd expect to get called, and a lot of the time I would be absolutely dominating his range because King Rag, Queen Rag suited, King 8 offsuit, King 9 offsuit, these are hands that I fully expect to get called with. Hands that normally I'd think, oh, how do I play the King Jack suited? He's 4x'd it. Do I flat? Should I fold? Well, no, against this guy you just ship and count the money, to be honest. And here was another interesting spot, because this player is so weak that you really do want to get involved, particularly when you got position with him, and your hand is semi-decent. 9 Jack against his range is semi-decent. The skill edge will be so huge being in position, nice and deep stacked, 22, 23 big blinds deep. So normally this would just be a straight up fold once someone's limped, but I'd love to get involved with the guy. And then the question is, do I limp behind or do I isolate? Well, if I look at, see if I can say it right, is Losikas in the big blind. I can see that he's a low stakes, relatively break even reg. So generally speaking, he's going to play a quite straightforward strategy at that stake. So I'd like to isolate because he's a reg, but I don't need to raise it to 60 or anything like that because he's going to have a very strict range that he plays early, most likely based on his average stake and average profit, but showing that he's somewhat break even or a tiny bit above break even. So that lets me know that yes, I don't want him involved, therefore I do want to isolate, and I don't need to raise that much to isolate because he's going to play relatively straightforward. And that's not a knock on the big blind. If you're playing lower stakes games, you do better when you play a straightforward strategy because there's no need to add the levels of complexity that you need to balance your range and to play back at certain regs. And the last example that we're going to look at is this 9-8 offsuit. Now I'm sure to a lot of people this just looks absolutely stupid. Min raising, under the gun, 9 high, not even suited, into someone who you know won't fold in the big blind. And at 15-30 this would just be a fold. But again, we've got 21 big blinds, effective stacks here, and this guy is a cash cow. We really, really want to get involved with him in position whenever we can. And I look behind, and we've got a bunch of regs, apart from maybe Miss Sweet. Miss Sweet's stats are a little less clear, so not the ideal opponent in that sense, because Miss Sweet might get involved, might flat, sort of moves that you wouldn't really expect regs to do, but it seems okay. And Jeff Bass is clearly a reg because he's blocked. It's Losikas who's a reg, so you expect to fold or a re-raise. Don't really care if they re-raise, my hand's easy enough to fold. It's not like I'm sitting there with ace 8 suited, ace 9 suited where it's tough. So I just want to get involved post flop with the player, and therefore I can profitably min raise it, just because if I do get involved and I do hit something, he's so likely to stack off with a gut shot, a flush draw, a bottom pair. When you exit very early in a tournament, 43% of the time, that's how you manage it, by hitting a piece of something or even a small tiny draw. 7 jack on a 8-9 king board and getting all your chips in with that gut shot. That's how you have an early finish position of 43%. So yeah, any opportunity to get involved as far as I'm concerned. So let's recap on what we know about Tournament Shark. So first of all, it just works out of the box. The view that you saw in the sweat session was the view that you get as soon as you install it. 1 minute, 2 minutes, and it's up and running. Lets you know who the good players are and who the bad players are, so you know not to leave yourself exploitable by the good players, and you know to attack the weaker players. That's where you get your money. I just had a drop down menu, changed it to just show me sit and goes. I didn't want people's statistics to show how they've done in MTTs or heads up games or anything like that. But it's very easy to customize your filters. If you only want to know how people do in 6 max hyper turbo games, you just set that as a filter, and those are the only numbers that will show up. And it's so easy to change between them. If you have that as your filter, so you know how good the regs are that you're playing, because you play a lot of 6 max hypers, but then someone you don't see comes up and he's only got 10 games, click the drop down menu and just say show me all sit and goes, and in 1 second you've got all their sit and go stats to give you a more full picture of their skill level. And something that's really valuable is knowing the finish distribution. You get to just play so much more profitably against players when you know if they like to get busted early or not. Well, no one likes to get busted early, but some people do and some people don't. And the people who don't, you can make some moves on. The people who do, you can make a different kind of move on, and certainly get much more involved with them with weaker hands. It also comes with unlimited searches, so you don't have to ever worry about, does my subscription, will it give me data if I play 300 hyper turbos, or will I run out of searches to get the stats on players? You get unlimited searches with it. The HUD layout is fully customizable. Colours, what stats appear, how big they are, how translucent it is, how opaque it is, what your pop-ups are that comes in. You can really do whatever you want with the Tournament Shark heads-up display. and it works for tournament formats, scheduled, MTTs, heads ups, sit and goes, 6-mans, 9-mans, 50-50s, all of those it works very well with. So I think it's quite a useful tool. I find that the information can be utilised to really make yourself a lot more profitable. As far as I'm concerned, that's the name of the game. So hope you found the video useful. Hope you understand a bit more about what Tournament Shark is and how it can be used to make more money. Till next time, I'm Al, MB261 McLennan, signing off.